It begins as a man announces the discovery of a new world named Epsilon Eridani B and the launch of Tantalus 2 with 200 passengers to the new world. The PCGI military prison facility was located in Mars and ex-commander Jan Lepre was being interviewed there. The man demands that she tell the truth even though she claims to have told the truth in the previous interviews. She starts to confess the incident, beginning with them getting closer to the arrival. The crew was discussing what they planned to do once they arrive in Epsilon, and inside the ship there were 200 people frozen and waiting for the landing. Commander Jan Lepre states that she plans on retiring in the new world, and the others plan on meeting their families and building a home. As the ship got closer to its destination, suddenly it's hit by an asteroid and started to lose power. After the crash, they all gather and learn that it's best to keep the passengers frozen since they don't know how far they are from the settlement. Commander Lepre is led by a team to see the ones that didn't survive, and she orders Kane to bury the dead, Chris, Dylan, and Gemma. Soon, John from communications shows up and asks for equipment to help him make contact with Earth, and Carrie and John leave to get gears from the ship. Once they reach it, they find Ellen, who was pouring water from the tank into a bottle, and Lepre goes to Russ, the pilot, and assures him help will come since the settlement's been tracking them since they entered the solar system, and they agree to keep the passengers safe and secure the ship. Carrie and John continue to look for a black box as Lepre goes to warn them about a situation. However, Carrie falls back and lands on an iron that goes through her back. They all try to help her, and Scott assists in getting the iron out, and other members of the crew were sitting somewhere else, and they learn that the ship's engine is still running. Scott comes and announces that they need to shield and take care of the DNA archives, and Lepre explains to Dan the closer they get those samples to civilization, the better chance of survival as it contains DNA of plants and animals. And John, on the other hand, was with Ellen trying to get connection with the settlement by getting a signal and tracing it back to learn where they are, and they continue to talk about their career as they wait for a signal before they hear an animal howling. Lepre also hears the sound with the crew and asks Scott what it could be, but he tells them it could be anything. The next morning, John shows the crew what he came up with, and he's able to find a static, which is a global location, and their present location. All he has to do is backtrace it and find out their location, and they learn the whole thing takes a 3-day march, and Dan was not happy with them and seems to contradict them, but Lepre continues to make peace with the situation. Soon they begin to move to reach Segan, and Ellen and John continue to walk, discussing their crush and mention the problem that they will be facing if they run out of food. Kane and Alexa were moving with Carrie, who needs a transfusion as soon as possible, and Lepre decides that they should take a break and ask the group if they have a blood type O negative, and Dan says he is positive and continues to argue with Lepre on why they stopped and states that he wants to keep moving with or without the group. He goes to suggest that they should leave without Carrie since she's holding them back and won't make it alive. He scolds Lepre for not knowing what to prioritize, and the interrogator asks Lepre why she didn't gather everyone and assess the situation. More importantly, why she didn't let Dan take control and command the team. She continues to tell him that she was intimidated by him and that he was starting to make everyone uncomfortable. Out of the fields, the crew notices people approaching them, assuming it's a search party. However, as they see the people close, they realize it's Chris, Taylor, and Brent. They sense something must be wrong as they look like they're possessed and walking weird, and Russ tries to approach Chris and talks to him, but Chris lunges at him and the group kills 3 of them and wonder what's happened after they buried them. Then they go out to tell the rest of the crew what they've witnessed, and they decide that it's better to burn the corpses since burying them didn't work. Scott tries to interfere with the plan, saying that the settlers never had any contact for 10 years with any complex life, and Dan tries to take the credit for saving their lives. Lepre decides that they stop for Alexa to take a look at Carrie, and then they camp out. The group gathers after getting water that they filtered out, and they bring out food to eat, but Alexa stops them, saying that they were out in the wild. Soon Carrie begins to cough, and we hear animal sounds howling. Dan and Kane go out to look where it's coming from, and Lepre joins them. And unable to see anything, they decide to move over to the trees to get cover and hide, and she orders Dan to organize a shift pattern and guard while the others get some rest. In the middle of the night, we see Dan discussing his family, where he explains that his ex-wife and his daughter were back on Earth living in London. Dan suggests that Lepre is going to get them all killed and that he should be in charge of the mission, and he asks for the other team member for support, and he grants him his word. Lepre gets questions about Dan and how he kept them safe through the night and saved their lives, and the man asks about the noise, and Lepre tells him that even though they don't know where it came from, that it was what kept them on the move and made them alert. The crew got a signal, and John stops to tell them, and he then continues to try and send a message, but in that moment, Carrie gets up and attacks Kane. She bites him on the neck before Dan shoots her, and Kane dies instantly, and Dan blames Lepre for everything that's been happening. Soon they all see an insect leaving Carrie's brain, and Alexa explains that it's some sort of parasite that must have burrowed right into the brain and controlled all motor functions. Lepre questions why it hasn't attacked them during the night, but guesses it can't override the brain's function of a living creature, but seeks out a recently deceased host. John tells them that their transmitter is broken because Dan kicked it earlier, and while they burn Kane's corpse, Ellen comforts Dan about his friend's death. Dan continues to attack Lepre, blaming her for the killings, but Russ stops him, claiming that he crashed the ship and that he's the one to be blamed. Russ takes one of his guns, even though he gets into a fight with them, and soon the group rests, and Scott suggests that they eat the food they found, since they're running out of food, but Lepre warns him not to. John then gets a signal from a transponder close by, and they assume that they're being saved. They all decide to head to the transponder instead of waiting for a rescue, and once they arrive at the location, they find the transponder is from a Chinese space agency from the first Epsilon mission, which was 50 years ago, and the remains of the crew. Lepre suggests that they leave, but Ellen insists that they bury the remains, so John stays with her along with Dan. Dan asks if he can help, but John responds to him harshly. However, Ellen asks him to stay, and Dan continues to tell them about how Lepre isn't well trained for this situation, and they begin to argue to be stopped by Ellen. Russ and Lepre discuss Dan's harsh behavior, and he continues to tell her something, but is stopped by Alexa. She tells her there's something wrong with Scott and he's been acting strange, and in the meantime, Scott falls and they learn that he ate the fruit that he wasn't allowed to eat. Alexa gets mad when she learns what happened, but they weren't able to move, so they get settled there after Alexa stabilizes him. The man questions Lepre's capabilities and the choices she made. Ellen tells John that she couldn't get through to Dan since he does unexpected things, and John explains about AI back on Earth and relates it to Dan as someone who's a child that's hurt and lashes out at everything. He continues to tell her that the ship chose to wake up the people who survived because they're important in different fields, and Alexa was with Scott, who tells her that he tried out the food to keep her safe and to see if they could eat it. Soon he begins to yell in pain and he passes out. But suddenly though, he gets up and tries to tell her that they're on the wrong way, but Dan shoots him in the head before he could finish his sentence. Lepre gets mad at him as Alexa continues to sob, and they all gather and think of a way to save the passengers, and John says that they should save themselves as well, and Dan starts to mock Lepre, but Russ defends her, and Dan continues to insult Russ with no stop. John stops them and asks Dan to help him get a signal using a radio, and Lepre goes to confront Alexa, who tells her why Scott decided to try the food, but Lepre tells her that they all wanted him not to. Alexa confesses their plan to start a new family in the new world, but that plan is now short-lived. The remaining of the crew arrive at a field, and John tells them that he might try to get a signal one more time before the radio dies, and suggests that they head to a higher spot for it to work. Ellen tells them that Sagan is up in the mountain, however Alexa tells Lepre that she can't even move, let alone climb a mountain. Lepre finds Russ sitting alone and asks what's wrong, and he tells her that he's done and feels guilty for what happened. He mentions all the people who died, including the passengers, and takes the blame for everything, and he claims that he's a murderer, but she tells him that he's a pilot and the decisions can't be changed now. So he tells her to go and he checks his gun while left alone. In the middle of the night, Lepre wakes up to find Dan awake and asks why he won't sleep, and she also finds out that Russ was missing, and he tells her that Russ went for a walk and that that's all he knows since he didn't ask for details. However, she assumes that Dan did something to him in the night. Soon the whole crew woke up and started to question Dan about Russ, making it seem like he killed him. And Alexa finds Dan's ID pouch, and the crew learns about Dan's blood type being O negative, which was the same as Gary. They all get mad at him for lying about it when asked for a transfusion, and he responds that the reason was because it wouldn't save Carrie, and he would just lose a lot of blood for nothing. This leads them to believe that he has killed Russ, and Ellen takes his gun and checks if it's been used since last night, and learns that he's telling the truth. Exhausted by their assumptions, Dan decides to leave for Siegen without them. The next morning, the rest of the crew meet up with Dan, who went ahead of them, and he was surprised that they reached him and continues to blame Lepre before he orders them to follow him. However, a fight begins and Dan punches John before he goes to attack Lepre, and he is then shot by Russ before he was able to kill Lepre. John goes to see Ellen, who was shot by Dan during the commotion, and he gets sad. It ends as Lepre tries to convince the interrogator that she doesn't remember what happened after this, but he explains that she's the only one who survived and that's suspicious. She continues to wail as she tells him a lot happened and she couldn't remember everything, and he closes the session and sends out Lepre to her cell. Back on the mission, the crew arrives at the location that they thought was Siegen, but learn that they went the wrong way, which makes Alexa remember what Scott tried to tell her. And on the last scene, Lepre is seen with a scar in the back of her neck as she is led to her cell by the guard.